As we welcome in the former assistant general manager of the Vancouver Canucks, NHL executive with the Canucks, Leafs, Coyotes, and Jets, Mr. Laurence Gilman. How are you? Say hi to Patrick.
Patrick, how are you? You're a sight for sore eyes, I must say.
It's great to see you, not just on Instagram.
Mm-hmm. Were you covering the team when he was working?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, but
you met later in life.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was doing a lot of yoga.
Right.
It's true.
That is true.
When we used to bring him in for Wednesdays with, that's when Gilman went through his transformation. Like suddenly he was the fittest guy in the building. We haven't talked to you since the big activity on Friday, Laurence. So let's go at this one at a time. First things first, what did you make of the JT Miller trade?
Well, let me answer that in a different fashion, because although you did not give me a heads up on what we would talk about today, I kind of had a hunch that we would discuss Friday's events. And I think, in fairness to the Canucks and your listeners, I think you need to analyze the totality of the circumstances and look at the asset allocation that occurred in total. And, in thinking about it over the weekend, what occurred to me was there are two kinds of trades in the modern NHL. There are hockey deals, and then there are money deals. And each type of deal has its own time and place, depending upon where your team is at in its cycle. And in this tandem of deals, I really feel that Rutherford and Alvin were able to accomplish both to the betterment of their hockey team. Leaving aside the fact that, taking JT Miller out of the room and out of the team has had a decompressing effect, which has been palpable. You could see it in the way the team has played in the last 3 games. Let's analyze the hockey side of the deal first. In the two deals, the Canucks moved out JT Miller, who's a 31-year-old 1 or 1A centerman. They moved out Danton Heinen, who's a 29-year-old bottom 6 soft forward. And they moved out Vincent Desharnais, who's a bottom pairing, limited skill defenseman, something that they have numerous commodities of. And they brought back Philip Hedl, who's a 25-year-old 2-3 center. And the Canucks are banking on the fact that he's closer to a 2, because by virtue of the fact that he played behind Trocheck and Zibanejad for most of his time in New York. He brought back Marcus Pettersson, who's a 28-year-old, call him a top 4 pairing defenseman, who has been utilized with high-risk, high-reward defensive partners like Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang. That says to me that this is a guy who's incredibly dependable, who coaches trust, a player like a Chris Tanev, or, to date myself, a Teppo Numminen, who's just a Swiss Army knife defenseman. I mean, every competitive Stanley Cup competing team needs that. You also brought back Drew O'Connor, who's a bottom 6 forward who has size and grit and plays with, a certain amount of tenacity. And then you brought back the Mancini kid, who, hopefully it hasn't been the kiss of death for this kid that everybody has said he's going to be a top pairing defenseman. But, the upside for him is pretty good. And yes, the Canucks gave up the best player in the deal, but they addressed needs that they had and changed the chemistry of their team. And I was one who has more or less shouted from the rooftops that they need to upgrade their defense. And they did that in this deal. And I quite frankly, from the hockey side, I like it. Now let's turn the ledger and go to the money side of the deal. In the first transaction, moving out JT Miller and Erik Brannstrom, and I must give credit to Cody Sievertson of Canucks Army, because while I had thought this through, I read today he did the math. So I haven't double checked his math, but I'm pretty certain he's right. In the New York transaction, moving out JT Miller and Brannstrom, they moved out $43 million worth of obligation and took back 12 in Hedl and Mancini. Now, JT Miller is a great player. He's 31 years old. He's owed $42 million or whatever it is on that contract, which expires, I believe, in 2030, at which point he'll be 37 years old. A deal like that doesn't age well. Unfortunately for teams, what happens in the National Hockey League is that players earn the most money at the end of their career when their skills are declining. And I don't think that deal is going to be very good in the last year or two. I could be wrong, but a player who burns as hot as JT Miller tends to have more of a cataclysmic decline in their productivity. And you moved out Brandstrom, who was a piece they didn't need. In the other deal, they moved out two other players that they had no use for, in Hronek and Hronek, who had $6 million worth of obligation, and they swapped that back for $2 million in the form of Pettersson and O'Connor. And yes, they are going to try and sign both those players, I believe. So there will be an obligation, but that's a lot of flexibility. I mean, that's a good money deal for them as well. So when the dust settles on this, I mean, I'm certain they have more moves to make. I think, by all accounts, they probably want to find another center iceman somewhere. And I hear Soucy's name is being bandied about. But when the dust settles on that deal, I think they made themselves a better hockey club, both in their dressing room and on the ice.
In adding up that equation, to me, that cap space is massive, isn't it? I mean,
can you tell he's a former capologist? I know he hates the term, but can you tell?
But it's massive, isn't it? I mean, it's not just that they've removed the player that's contract going to age badly, but they've actually given themselves to do it again. They can find something better with that cap space.
It only took 20 years for general managers, or 20 years or so, for general managers to understand the value of cap space. And the teams, one needs to merely look at the announcement the National Hockey League made last week in terms of the rise of the cap. Like, the top end teams, the high revenue teams in the National Hockey League are licking their chops because it provides them so much more opportunity and flexibility to address the needs of their hockey club and go out and get players that are going to make them better. Like, cap space is king, like in the National Hockey League. I mean, obviously you have to have good players to win, and you need to build the team properly. And draft and develop well and do all of that. But yes, Patrick, you hit the nail on the head. Like, moving out $43 million worth of obligation is a pretty good thing for the Canucks at the end of the day.
You would have seen Hedl 2-3 times a year when you were there with the Leafs. You mentioned 2-3C, and they're hoping he can become a 2C. Give me the player evaluation there. What do you think of Filip Hedl?
Well, I've always liked Filip Hedl. I from the time he was drafted, I mean, he plays with speed, he plays with skill, he's got a good shot. The only issue that's really set him back are the injuries that he's had, and again, the fact that he's played on a really good team. It's tough to be a young. That's a double-edged sword when you're a young player coming into a good team, because on the one hand you play behind good players, but on the other hand you get to play with good players. I think he's a guy who has more to give, for sure. And I think he fits what the Canucks are doing. And if this deal opens up time, space, mental capacity for Elias Pettersson, the forward, he could slot in as a very effective second-line center for them, and that would be a really good 1-2 punch.
How hard is it to project, though? I mean, we always see the sort of question, if this guy only had, more minutes, you could just blow him up and you become this incredible player. That's the hardest thing, though, isn't it?
Well, listen, it's not an exact science, ever. One needs to look back at what the player was in his junior career, where Filip, Hedl was a number one center coming up and growing up, which is why he was picked in the first round. But you don't know what the player development was like in his prior organization. You don't know how he was impacted by his place in the cosmos, so to speak. So it's always a roll of the dice when you bring a young player in. And there are instances where, Marcus Naslund was a struggling young player in Pittsburgh who came to Vancouver and flourished. Cam Neely was a young player who had his warts in Vancouver and went to Boston and flourished. So, you can win big on these deals, but there is a gamble with it for sure.
Are they done? Should they be done here, Laurence? Right on the playoff precipice? Do you think they need to make additions to cement their place as a playoff team?
Well, I would be in wait-and-see mode and watch and see how the team as a whole does, how Elias Pettersson does. I'll touch on Soucy for a moment. This guy's paying the price and is the whipping boy in the market, which I think is somewhat nonsensical. He was a pretty darn good and effective defenseman for the Canucks last year, particularly in the playoffs. And a guy doesn't go from being a good player to a bad player, overnight. And I think what happens is when the construction of your team, and let's use the defense core as an example, when it is flawed, and it has been flawed, not enough, you had two top end guys in Quinn Hughes and Hronek who've both had injury issues, and Myers, and the drop off after that has been significant. And what happens when that occurs, and as I said, they had a whole host of, or a bunch of bottom six defensemen, that puts extra pressure on a player like Soucy, who should slot in as a fourth/fifth guy on a decent team. But having that much pressure and playing greater minutes means mistakes happen. And I'm willing to bet that as time goes on, his play is going to improve, and maybe they don't need to go out and do something else. But time will tell.
Yeah. Well, help me out on the market for Soucy then, Laurence. He's got a full no trade this year. It becomes a 12-team no trade list in July. He's making $3.25. He's got one more year left. He's got size that you can't teach, and was pretty effective in the playoffs last year as a stopper against some terrific forwards. What do you think he's worth out there on the trade market?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what your needs are. I definitely believe, again, let's go back to the cap rising as much as it is. The teams are always looking for defensemen, particularly as the playoffs approach. And having him under contract for one more year is not that arduous. And they would be able to move him, to a number of teams. What they get for him depends what they want. I mean, if they would just want to, as Patrick said, clear up the cap space, they can, get a decent draft pick for him, or they can get a prospect who's not playing in the league, or they can package him with something else and maybe get the center iceman that they think that they need. Again, what I would do is I would sit back and assess what we have, what the team has for the time being, and then make a decision with respect to Soucy or anybody else for that matter.
Given Jim Rutherford's track record, I the moment I heard that, maybe they'll trade him, I kind of went, well, hold on. This is a guy that actually can play in the NHL, and Jim Rutherford has always stockpiled defensemen. I mean, that's been a lesson over the course of his entire career. So the idea of them moving on, I mean, to me, I guess I get why they could be frustrated with how he's played, but the potential seems to me it's still there. There's not a notion that suddenly this guy's turned into a useless part.
The history is littered with defensemen. We talked about players, forwards that have struggled and moved on. Larry Murphy was a player that they basically ran out of Toronto at one point, who then went on and became a linchpin to Detroit's Stanley Cup winning teams. Like, this guy's a decent defenseman. He's just been overpressured because of the flawed construction of the defense, and has had to play above his punching weight. It's the same every year. Everyone starts the year, you have too many defensemen, the calendar turns, and you don't have enough. You can get rid of a player like Carson Soucy and regret it 2 games later.
Okay, Laurence, we have got to talk about Elias Pettersson, and just for your edification, because I know this isn't league wide yet. Elias the forward, Elias the defenseman. That's what we're going with here. Okay. To distinguish them.
Thanks for clarifying that for me.
Well, yeah. And honest to goodness, like, poor Elias Pettersson, because they're now calling him Junior, which I'm not sure he loves, and I'm not necessarily sure he would pronounce his name Elias if there wasn't already.
Well, he doesn't have a say in what they call him.
No, exactly. No. He is low man on the totem pole here, although some really nice returns here this week. But Elias Pettersson, the forward. So it has been a year now, a calendar year, where he has struggled through the second part last year, through the playoffs, and through the first 50-some games this year. How much patience can an organization have for a player with this kind of talent in this kind of slump? You mentioned Marcus Pettersson. People bring up the Sedins in this market. Heck, the guy they played yesterday, Nathan McKinnon, right? Like, he was not a straight bar graph to the top. He had his struggles too as a young player. But you tell me, how much patience can an organization show for a player with this kind of talent on this kind of ticket, who is now a year into a slump?
Well, more importantly, he's approaching the activation of a no movement clause on July 1st. So, first of all, what I would do in the case of Elias Pettersson is, now that this deal is done, I would bring him in, have a meeting with him, with the coach present. And, I've said this all along. I don't know what the issues were, but there obviously were issues that existed. And I would say to him, we've cleared the decks here, and you're the one who's staying. We made the election to keep you. It's now on you to become the player that we have expected you to be and who we're paying you to be. And if you don't become that player, we can't guarantee that you will necessarily be here in the future. And I would give him the time and give him the space and let him, and support, quite frankly, to let him be the best player that he can be. And then see how things go between now and the end of the season. And if you get to the end of the season and they're not satisfied with him, then you're going to the draft and you're trying to move him, I would think.
Yeah. One follow-up there, LG. He doesn't seem like the type of personality who has responded to pressure in the past.
Well, again, I'm giving it to
would underlining it heap more pressure on him? Or is it just a matter of, you're an NHL player, a frontline center making $11.6 million. Like, at some point, you've got to learn to handle, deal, and succeed despite pressure.
I'm giving it to you in my inimitable, harsh manner. I would soft sell it a little more, but that would be the message that I would give to the guy. I actually think Elias Pettersson,
yeah.
Okay, I got it right. I don't think he's been as bad as everybody else does. Like, I watched that game against Detroit, and he nearly won it. He had the game on his stick, and Alex Lyons made an unbelievable save. And then Elias was out of gas, which caused him to be behind the play on the odd man rush, which led to the opening goal. But he could have been the hero of that game, but instead he's more or less the GOAT. And for what it's worth, in that game, I didn't think his line mates were very good, particularly Jake DeBrusk. But I think you got to just wait and see. Let this guy, let him play hockey. And I actually believe he's going to respond. I don't know what lingering issues are there with respect to his injuries that he's had. I don't think he has not looked like a player who has had any fun. I will tell you that in watching that team last night, they looked like a team that had the weight of the world lifted off their shoulders. They played with energy. They played with pizzazz. They played with speed. And, that spreads around. It's infectious in a hockey team. And hopefully he catches whatever that is and produces.
All right. We're out of time for this week, but I look forward to our discussions here on Wednesdays as we approach the deadline, because as everybody seems to concur, this is a very important month for the Vancouver Canucks, not just for this season, but going forward as well.
It is.
Thanks, Laurence.
Hold on one thing. Patrick, I need you to do me a favor.
Let's go.
Tell Ben Kuzma that Alexander Haig said hello.
Absolutely, will do.
You can talk about that one after I'm gone.
Yeah, we'll
we sure will. We sure will. Thanks, Laurence.
Okay, guys. Thank you very much.